What changed in the last hour? Here is what changed in the last hour and why it matters. Multiple reports indicate a shift in congressional posture today, not a rumor, not a leak, but a procedural move that carries consequences. That context matters because the language circulating online uses words like meltdown, which describe tone and reaction, not a diagnosis, not a legal finding, and not a conclusion. According to those reports, Congress has advanced a demand through established channels, described cautiously by outlets and sources familiar with the process. What followed was a familiar response from Donald Trump, forceful, public, and aimed outward, framing the moment as grievance rather than procedure. The contrast is the point. One side operates through institutions and timelines, the other through rhetoric and immediacy. This is not about personality, temperament, or spectacle. It is about what happens when oversight intersects with resistance, and how systems respond under pressure. Moments like this feel explosive because they compress time, but accountability does not move at the speed of social media. If this were just another outburst, it would fade. The timing is why it doesn't, and understanding that timing requires watching Congress proceed now. The demand. What Congress is reportedly asking for. To understand today's development, we need to slow this down and be precise. Congress does not act through vibes or headlines. It acts through defined authorities. Committees are empowered to request documents, invite testimony, and when necessary, issue subpoenas. Each tool carries different legal weight, different timelines, and different consequences for non-compliance. And that distinction is often lost in the noise. According to reporting so far, what surfaced today falls into the category of a formal demand routed through committee procedure. Some details are confirmed, others are still being characterized by sources familiar with the matter, which is why careful language matters here. A request is not yet a subpoena, and a subpoena is not a verdict. It is a mechanism to obtain information deemed relevant to legislative oversight. Why does this specific demand matter now? Because timing in Congress is rarely accidental. Committees move when jurisdiction, evidence, and political alignment intersect. Procedural escalation usually signals that informal cooperation has stalled, or that lawmakers believe the record is incomplete. That does not imply guilt, it implies unresolved questions. This is where impulse narratives fail. Congress does not advance demands because of emotion or retaliation. It does so because process requires documentation before conclusions. That discipline is exactly what makes the reaction to this moment revealing. On its own, the demand is routine. Paired with the response it triggered, it invites a harder question about why this request struck a nerve and what pressure it may be applying behind the scenes. And that unanswered pressure point is where accountability stories begin, not end. The next step is not reaction, but verification, as committees decide whether process escalates further or whether compliance quietly resolves what public rhetoric has only amplified so far. That decision point is approaching faster than headlines suggest today. Trump's response: rhetoric versus reality. Trump's response arrived quickly, and it arrived loudly. According to public statements and posts reported today, the language followed a familiar structure: outrage first, accusation second, and process framed as persecution. Institutions were cast as hostile actors, motives were questioned, and the demand itself was portrayed not as oversight, but as an attack. That framing is intentional, and it is strategic. This is a pattern Trump has relied on for years. Victim framing shifts focus away from the substance of a request and onto personal grievance. Delegitimizing institutions turns procedural actions into political theater. When courts, committees, or agencies are described as corrupt or weaponized, the goal is not rebuttal, but erosion of trust in the referee itself. But here is the reality that rhetoric cannot bend. Congress does not need permission from the subject of an inquiry to exercise oversight. The law allows committees to seek information relevant to legislative duties, regardless of how loudly that authority is challenged. Anger does not nullify jurisdiction. Volume does not dissolve obligation. What Trump claims is happening and what is actually happening exist on different tracks. One is a public narrative designed for immediate consumption. The other is a slow-moving process governed by statutes, precedent, and enforcement mechanisms that do not respond to tone. The system does not argue back. It waits, documents, and escalates if necessary. That difference matters. Rhetoric can rally supporters, but it does not alter deadlines or standards. Courts do not weigh outrage, they weigh compliance. Committees do not negotiate with posts, they proceed with records. This is why moments like this feel explosive on the surface but rigid underneath. When reaction outpaces reality, it often signals pressure. Not proof, not conclusion, but stress between claims and constraints. And that stress is revealing, because it tends to surface repeatedly, whenever oversight tightens. This is not new, it is familiar. And understanding that pattern is essential, because today's headline only makes sense when placed inside a longer sequence of confrontations between power and accountability. Those cycles repeat until institutions either hold or accountability erodes under sustained political pressure again. Pattern recognition, why this isn't isolated. This moment only looks sudden if it is viewed in isolation. When placed against recent history, it fits into a recurring sequence that is played out whenever oversight tightens. Past investigations, whether congressional or judicial, have produced similar responses: rapid public pushback, claims of unfair targeting, and language framing accountability as persecution rather than process. The elements repeat. The timing is often immediate before details are fully known. The language escalates quickly, emphasizing personal grievance over procedural substance. Institutions are described as acting in bad faith, while the underlying request or inquiry is treated as illegitimate by definition. None of this resolves the inquiry itself, but it reliably shifts public attention away from what is being asked and toward who is supposedly asking it. In legal and political analysis, patterns matter because they inform expectations. Courts, committees, and enforcement bodies do not treat repetition as proof of wrongdoing, but they do recognize behavior that predicts resistance, delay, or non-compliance. Pattern recognition is not an accusation. It is a tool used to assess risk, allocate resources, and anticipate next steps. This is why today's reaction is being examined alongside previous episodes, rather than as a standalone event. When the same strategies appear under similar pressure points, analysts focus less on tone and more on trajectory. Is cooperation likely, or is escalation probable? Will the process resolve quietly, or will it require enforcement mechanisms to engage? Congressional process is deliberately slow, and that slowness is often mistaken for weakness. After a formal demand is issued, the first step is response, either compliance, negotiation, or silence. Committees typically allow time for documents to be gathered, reviewed, and produced because the record matters more than speed. If material is incomplete or withheld, follow-up letters narrow the scope and clarify expectations. Enforcement tools exist, but they are layered. Committees can escalate from requests to subpoenas. If a subpoena is ignored, Congress may pursue contempt, which can move through the courts or in some cases through inherent powers rarely used in modern times. Each escalation introduces delay, not because the system is broken, but because due process is built in. Timelines frustrate observers because they do not match political cycles or social media rhythms. Weeks pass, then months. Courts weigh arguments, deadlines shift. This is normal. Outcomes are rarely immediate because legitimacy depends on procedure being followed carefully, even when the subject is controversial. Media oversimplification often fuels misunderstanding. Headlines suggest instant consequences or dramatic showdowns when most accountability unfolds quietly through filings, negotiations, and rulings that never trend online. Silence does not mean inaction. It usually means work is happening off camera. This is why outrage does not drive results. Volume does not accelerate subpoenas. Anger does not shorten judicial review. Consequences arrive only when process is allowed to run its course. That restraint is intentional, and it is protective, ensuring outcomes hold under scrutiny rather than collapsing under appeal. Understanding this matters now because moments of public escalation often coincide with procedural steps the audience never sees. The system moves whether attention follows or not, and when compliance holds, the story often ends quietly. When it breaks down, escalation follows rules, not emotion. That fork in the road determines whether today becomes a footnote or the beginning of something far more consequential. That unresolved uncertainty is deliberate. Systems are built to reveal cooperation or resistance over time, not in press conferences. When compliance occurs, tension dissipates without spectacle. When it does not, mechanisms activate that narrow choices and raise stakes incrementally. This is the quiet pressure most audiences never witness, and it is why today's noise should be read cautiously. Process explains the how, But the unanswered question is what happens next if compliance breaks down. That determination arrives only through institutions, not personalities or volume alone. This moment matters beyond any single figure because it tests the durability of congressional authority itself. Oversight is not a partisan preference. It is a constitutional function designed to restrain power through inquiry. When that authority is challenged rhetorically, the immediate target may be a committee, but the long-term effect is broader, a signal about whether institutions can compel answers without being delegitimized in the process. Public trust erodes when accountability is reframed as persecution. If every request for documents is cast as an attack, the public is taught to see oversight not as governance, but as abuse. That distortion does lasting damage because democratic systems depend on shared acceptance of rules, even when outcomes are uncomfortable. When the referee is portrayed as corrupt, the game itself becomes unplayable. Precedent is the quiet force here. Future office holders watch how resistance is rewarded or constrained. If loud defiance successfully delays or derails oversight, it becomes a model. If process holds, it becomes a deterrent. This is why institutions are cautious. They are not reacting to a moment. They are setting expectations for what power will face when scrutiny arrives again. Separating personal politics from institutional survival is essential. Individuals cycle through office. Norms must endure beyond them. The question is not whether one person feels aggrieved, but whether mechanisms designed to check authority remain functional under pressure. That is a systemic concern, not a partisan one. Seen this way, today is a stress test. It measures whether established norms bend without breaking when confronted with sustained rhetorical force. Democracies rarely fail in dramatic collapses. They erode through repeated exceptions that become habits. Each confrontation either reinforces the boundary between power and accountability or weakens it slightly. That is why the stakes feel heavier than the headline suggests. This is not about winning an argument online. It is about whether institutions retain the capacity to ask, to verify, and to enforce without being drowned out by narrative warfare. Stakes only become real when consequences are mapped, and mapping those consequences requires examining what happens next when process meets resistance. That evaluation will not come from speeches or rallies, but from filings, deadlines, and enforcement decisions that accumulate quietly. As those decisions stack, they convert abstract stakes into measurable outcomes. That conversion, slow and procedural, is what ultimately determines whether norms harden or fracture under sustained challenge from institutions tested repeatedly over time. Consequences map political, legal, public. Consequences are not predictions. They are ranges shaped by choices that follow process. Politically, the immediate effect is narrative pressure. Voters absorb cues about strength, fairness, and legitimacy, while party leaders weigh distance versus defense. None of that resolves facts, but it influences incentives around cooperation and escalation, especially as timelines stretch and attention shifts. Legally, the map is narrower and less dramatic. Compliance leads to closure. Partial compliance leads to negotiation. Non-compliance invites courts, motions, and delay. Delay is not victory, it is time bought at cost. Judges prioritize records, not rhetoric, and every filing adds weight to the eventual outcome. These paths are conditional, dependent on responses yet to be taken, which is why certainty is irresponsible here. Public consequences are quieter but cumulative. When institutional conflict becomes routine, expectations reset. Oversight feels optional. Resistance feels normal. That normalization erodes trust not through one event, but through repetition. Citizens learn to tune out process and focus on spectacle, weakening the shared commitment that makes accountability workable. What matters is understanding that these consequences do not arrive all at once. They stack. Political narratives harden, legal options narrow, public patience thins. Accountability, when it comes, reflects the accumulation of decisions made earlier, often unnoticed at the time. This is why restraint matters now. Reading every development as a final outcome distorts judgment. The system is still moving, still testing boundaries, still offering off-ramps and applying pressure. Outcomes remain contingent, shaped by choices on all sides. The consequences map is not a forecast. It is a framework for watching how power responds when rules persist. That final measure will hinge on consistency, patience, and enforcement, qualities rarely visible in real time but decisive over months, reminding viewers that accountability matures slowly, resists shortcuts, and ultimately reflects collective choices about law, legitimacy, and democratic endurance under sustained pressure when institutions confront resistance and choose between expedience and principle without yielding to performative outrage. After consequences comes judgment, not from pundits, but from values that decide whether institutions are allowed to finish what they start. Moral framing power versus accountability. Accountability is not punishment. It is the mechanism a democracy uses to confirm that power remains answerable after the applause fades. That distinction matters because loud power seeks immediacy, while accountability works quietly, methodically, often without spectacle. One demands attention, the other demands records. This is why this moment resonates with viewers who are skeptical of systems but still believe in rules. You have watched institutions fail when noise overwhelms restraint. You have seen outrage replace evidence and loyalty replace obligation. Accountability, when it functions, does the opposite. It resists speed. It tolerates frustration. It insists on verification before judgment. Power exercised loudly feels strong in the moment. It fills screens and commands crowds. But it is also fragile because it depends on constant reinforcement. Accountability applied quietly endures precisely because it does not need applause. It advances through deadlines, filings, and decisions that hold whether anyone is watching or not. This is a civic stress test, not a morality play. The test is whether institutions can continue operating without adopting the language or tactics used against them. Restraint is not weakness here. It is discipline. Patience is not surrender. It is confidence in process. Vigilance is not obsession. It is sustained attention without hysteria. Nothing about this requires blind faith in leaders or media. It requires faith in procedures designed to outlast personalities. When accountability holds, it does not humiliate. It clarifies. It draws boundaries that apply to everyone, including those who shout the loudest. So where does this leave us right now? It leaves us watching process instead of performance, timelines instead of tantrums, and outcomes instead of promises. The moral clarity here is simple but demanding. Power must answer, even when it resists, even when it delays. Whether it ultimately does so will not be decided today, but the test is underway, and its result will shape how authority is constrained long after this moment passes. That outcome will signal whether restraint still carries authority or whether noise has learned to exhaust the system. Watching carefully is the responsibility now, because disengagement is how erosion accelerates, and attention, applied calmly, is how democratic guardrails are preserved during moments designed to provoke reaction without surrendering principle or legitimacy itself. What to watch next? Here is what we know and what we do not. It is confirmed that Congress has initiated a formal procedural step through established channels. It is confirmed that the response has been public, forceful, and framed as grievance. What remains unresolved is how compliance will unfold, whether negotiation occurs quietly or whether escalation becomes necessary. Those answers are not available yet, and pretending otherwise only distorts judgment. What comes next is procedural, not theatrical. Watch for deadlines, filings, and formal correspondence rather than statements. Watch whether documents are produced fully, partially, or not at all. Watch whether committees signal satisfaction or begin narrowing scope. These are the signals that matter, even when they arrive without fanfare. The temptation now is to read every headline as a verdict. Resist that. Headlines compress uncertainty into certainty because certainty travels faster. Accountability does not. It advances through accumulation, through records built piece by piece, through decisions that are rarely dramatic in isolation but decisive together.